When as listening to these panels, like one thing that, like an image popped in my head about like a Rubik's Cube, remember that old 80s toy with like where you have to get the sides, the colored sides to all line up. And I was thinking to myself, this is one of the reasons that, talking and dealing with teacher quality issues is so hard is because you turn one piece, you turn the retention piece and then like the colors on the other side of the cube on, let's say, I don't know, induction or professional development don't line up anymore. And I mean, it's this gigantic puzzle and it can actually seem very overwhelming. So, for example, I was thinking of, let's say we believe in higher entry standards for teachers, or having all teachers reach some sort of level of board certification. I think that's a great goal, but we're also in a time period where certain districts are having such a hard time finding any teachers, and they are going to emergency certifications and other things because of that. And we can talk about raising salaries as one way to get more teachers interested in the profession. But then we have to talk about, the overall compensation system, and we have to look at pensions. And so in other words, it's like every time we try to talk about one thing, the colors on the Rubik's Cube start to change a little bit. So my question about this is, it's a huge puzzle. It can seem very overwhelming, and we want to look at it systemically. But like, if you're a district, like, where do you start? Like, which color of the Rubik's Cube do you start with? Do you start with preparation? Do you start with your teachers who are in the classroom thinking about professional development and how you can make the teachers that you have the best? Or do you start, with the talent pool and salaries? Like, what would you three say? Which side of the Rubik's Cube do we start with?
Well, so I think you start with teaching and learning. And I know that sounds sort of simple, but when I was in both my superintendencies, which, look, these systems are so complex and there's so many different strings you can pull, right? And you can go all these different ways, and everyone's got a solution. And oftentimes there's money behind that solution, or there's politics behind it. And the only way that I ever knew how to organize anything was around what is it we want kids to know and be able to do, and how do you make sure that adults are acting in service of that 180 days a year, 7 hours a day? Like, start there. What do you want kids to know and be able to do? And in fact, with Common Core, that's why I've been so sort of distressed at the policies that have kept us away from the core aspect of what they represent in terms of what kids need to know and be able to do in the 21st century, because we've gotten bogged down with all this other stuff around how to evaluate teachers, and I won't go into all those things. But I think you start with that, and then, I think as Randy said, then you build on, okay, so what do teachers need to know and be able to do in service of it? What are those structures that exist? Dan brought up something interesting about, was it $18,000 per teacher per year and per PD? I think and don't quote me on this, but I think about 1/4% of a district's budget is spent on R&D. Right? So you're putting all this money into PD, professional development, but what are you doing in terms of research and development within a district? So, but you got to be really, really clear about what you want kids to know and be able to do, and then just keep blowing that one out more and more, and look at it very explicitly in terms of whether or not your teachers have the skills, and then are to be able to deliver that, are the structures there. I think that's where you start. And by the way, I will tell you, Rubik's Cubes are really popular today, as well, as evidenced in both my sons' bedrooms.
I didn't know if I was dating myself.
No,
with that
Rubik's
metaphor
Cube, they've made a
being
huge
child of
comeback.
the
It's
80s.
weird. It's really weird. Yeah.
Rubik's Cube and chess.
Yes. Yeah.
Look, I agree with Josh. You have to start with, can you hear me, or? I agree with Josh. You have to start with teaching and learning. But not everyone in a system has to start with teaching and learning. Meaning, one of the reasons that you have systems with back offices as opposed to, you have school systems as opposed to systems of schools, is that there can be other people who are doing other things, like the back office in a school system should be there in service of what happens in schools, not there to regulate schools. And part of in service of what happens in schools is they can also help in terms of preparation. They can also help in terms of transportation. They can also help in terms of how you get community schools structured for schools. There's a lot of things that a back office can do if it is viewed as being in service of as opposed to regulating. But if I was, if to answer the question in terms of kids, I would start again with engagement. What is it that we're supposed to do in school X to help kids succeed this school year? And how can we organize ourselves so that we do that? And if there is trust, that's another T that I haven't said, if there is trust and there's an atmosphere of trust, not an atmosphere of everybody can do their own thing, but an atmosphere of trust connected to the mission of the school, then what becomes very apparent, whether you're in the middle of the instructional shifts to higher standards or whether you're in the middle of something else, that you can get to what are the strengths and weaknesses in different classrooms, in different grades, and how do we bolster that on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month level. But there has to be a collaborative relationship with trust, with time to do both the teaching of teachers and the feedback for teachers in order to then get the teaching of kids. Tony Alvarado used to use his hands to say this: if teachers are here, kids are here. If teachers are here, kids are here. And so it's a matter of the focus of how do you create what teachers need to know to help kids and do that. Last thing I'd say is we still have this placard. There's 3 things that if you could do them all at the same time would help virtually every school. Number 1 is a focus on this kind of ongoing teacher development. And giving teachers the time and the tools they need to do the work they need with kids, as well as the feedback. Number 2, engaging curriculum to get to the engagement that Josh talked about earlier and that parents saw in the PDK poll, because we need to actually give kids a reason to want to come to school and to have a joy about coming to school. And number 3 is, whether you call it social emotional learning, whether you call it wraparound services, we do have to deal with the fact that 50% of our kids are come from poverty, and lots of kids have lots and lots of other issues. That's not an excuse. It's just something that we have to deal with. So teacher the capacity building, engagement, and the wraparound services. Those 3 things, if I was God, those are the 3 things that I'd be focusing on every single day.
So here's a couple of things that I think are low-hanging fruit in virtually every school system, large, small, urban, suburban, rural. One is we do a terrible job of retaining our best teachers. This is something we wrote about in the Irreplaceables back in 2012. One of the things we found was that if you do some very simple things, your great teachers will be retained at a much higher rate. What do I mean by very simple? I'm not talking about spending $1 billion. I'm not talking about getting a new data system. Very, very simple. If the principal goes to a teacher who he or she knows is a great teacher and says, I think you're great. I want you to come back to my school next year. What do I have to do to make that happen? I know it's shocking, but teachers tend to come back at higher rates if you do that. So you can, if you're superintendent, you work in the district office, whatever, you're a union leader, you can set those goals. Hey, right now we're retaining 80% of our great teachers a year. If we could shift that to 95, not only would we be better as a group of educators, but we'd benefit thousands and thousands of kids. That can be done. You can move the needle on that relatively quickly.
It's called the Mensch factor.
The Mensch factor, yes, thank you. The technical term. Yes, if your principals are doing Mensch-like things with their great teachers, you're going to see results. Here's the other thing. and all of you, I know Rabbi Weisberg here is preaching to the choir, but so many districts, here's what happens. We open the school year, first day of school, kids come in, bright, shiny, ready to learn, and in the highest need schools, there are a bunch of substitutes. Nothing against substitutes, but they are there because the district basically couldn't get its hiring done in time to make sure that there are qualified permanent teachers in front of that classroom. Folks, that is something that is fixable. It is fixable. You can build a bigger pool of applicants on the front end. You can shrink the amount of time that it takes to get from interview to offer to actually getting on the payroll and benefits. All those things can happen, and you can open the year. I don't care if you are very high need, very large, very complex, far-flung district. You can open the year not just with permanent teachers sitting at the front of every classroom, including in your highest need schools, but teachers who were chosen competitively from among a much larger group of applicants. Those are things you can move the needle on in 1 year. Now, if that's all you do, I'm not saying you're going to get to all your goals, but those are meaningful things that will help teachers, that will help kids, and will build some momentum probably for some more complex, difficult challenges down the road.
So we actually have a lot of questions that have come in, and I think they're all really good. So rather than me ask questions, I'm just going to turn to the index cards, which I'm going to shuffle and pull out. We'll get to as many as we can. Okay. So, if a collaborative school environment and trusting relationship provides the foundation for improving teaching quality, which I think you all did say today, what do superintendents and school districts do to promote them? Don't make me start calling out names.
There's a ton of things that, I don't mean a ton of things. We all have reports. You know, this one says moving beyond compliance, lessons learned from teacher development and evaluation. Josh, the 47th PTK poll distills some of that out as well. I'm sure Dan, you know, I think as we're aging, we're agreeing more and more. But there's it can't be made up. You can't pretend that there's trust and collaboration and use those words when it doesn't exist. It has to be real and it has to be authentic. And trust and collaboration means that people feel like you got their back, like they can try something and their head is not going to get chopped off. Collaboration actually doesn't mean you're going to get to consensus on every decision. No CEO anywhere would say that that's a good idea. It means that you are authentically listening and people have a real voice and real agency. So, you know, we can go through a bunch of different places. Josh in Montgomery County did that with their unions. Other places we can find schools that do it. But the most important thing I could say is it has to be real. Trust, have to have the latitude, have to be able to take a risk, have to be able to say, oh my God, I really screwed up, and you know you're not going to get fired for it. Collaboration is, there's a real voice and real agency.
So I would first read my March 2011 piece in Kaplan Magazine that I wrote with Rebecca Thesson on this, right, on how you systematize it. It's pretty straightforward, I think, but it does take work. The expectation has to be really clear, right? You have to say to principals, build in time for professional learning communities, and you have to provide training for the principals and for the teachers. You have to measure it. Right, and there are different ways of measuring it. So one thing I did in Montgomery County was engagement surveys, right? Employee engagement surveys. And everybody from me, every single central office person, every single principal was accountable for the extent to which employees felt engaged in the work. What I did when I was in Stanford was setting professional learning communities. One thing you find out pretty quickly, some principals are incredible at scheduling. Other principals aren't. And schedules are actually the black box of school reform, right? And so you got to pair them up. You got to say, look, if you're really good at scheduling, you're not. Here's the school, same resources, same makeup. Learn from each other, right? And also, again, set the expectation. Make sure someone in central office knows how to do the scheduling so they can assist others. Make sure that your central office principal managers are evaluating principals according to the extent to which collaboration is happening. Is the time created during the day? You have to go in, and we did this again in my previous district, in both of them. Look at the agendas, look at the, sit in on team meetings, look at the agendas, be in the school and actually look at what's happening. And then you go and you talk to the teachers and you can gather data from them and say, is this collaboration actually working? So it's again, as Dan used the word unsexy before.
Well, for such a
it's not
nice,
great.
fluffy word, collaboration, it takes a lot of hard
You
work.
got to routinize it.
Yeah.
You got to system, and you actually have to measure what you expect. And unless the principal supervisor, and this goes back to what Randy was saying, and there is a level of regulation and compliance here, but unless the principal supervisor knows how to go in and sit in a team meeting and assess the level of discourse relative to what the instructional problem that you have, and you got to look at the school improvement plan and say, okay, is this a real plan? Do they actually spend their time in collaboration, talking about student data, talking about kids, talking about the plan? You got to align all that. The only way to do it is through routinizing it, systematizing it, and then assessing it according to direct observation and document review. But look at the schedule first.
So not a lot to add. I agree with Randy and Josh on this, but one, I just want to bring up a hard issue here. So a lot goes on the principal in the school level to promote an environment of collaboration and trust, and that's all right. And we certainly see that in our data when great teachers feel like administration is really invested in helping them to improve, they stay at that school at much greater numbers. So there's no question. But typically, again, back to reinvent, back to the way we design our schools. In how many schools do you have one principal supervising 25 teachers, right, or more? And in those situations, which is typical, if all we say is, okay, principal, you got to do a much better job of getting in the classrooms. You got to make sure you're creating time for professional learning communities. All your compliance stuff, by the way, you continue to have to do all of that. At a certain point, I mean, what's happening now, frankly, Randy talked about the numbers of people going into ed schools and teacher prep dropping. Principal is not exactly an attractive job right now either. So the answer can't be, okay, we'll just give every principal, funding to hire 5 or 6 assistant principals. That's not going to happen. I would like to look like Brad Pitt. That's not going to happen, right? So what is it? How are we going to, don't laugh that hard, it wasn't that fun. How are we going to restructure the schools so that, by the way, no other profession has that span of control. One manager for 25 professionals. Nobody does that. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, architects, accountants, nobody does that. How do we fundamentally change that without going back to the taxpayers and saying we want to double your property tax bill, which isn't going to be politically feasible in just about anywhere? So I don't have the answer to that, but I think that's a tough question.
But this is actually where contractual relationships that are positive and affirming, and where teacher leadership can hugely help, and where the alignment issues come into play. When I talk about principals in this way, there has to be an alignment. You can't say one thing and do something else. But I think what Josh said about the kind of practices that get you there is important, but the will and the practice become important. But a principal in a school that works, a principal doesn't do everything. A principal becomes a conductor of lots and lots of great, musical ensembles in different kinds of ways. But in schools that are not working, you also tend to see the principal taking on far too much, both responsibility and authority.
So I just want to remind the people that are watching this online that they can also ask questions by using the hashtag Teaching Quality. All right, we're going to go to our next question. So why national board certification? It's expensive. It takes a lot of time. It's costly. What's the value?
Well, I guess I was the one that brought that up. So, I mean, look, National Board isn't the only thing, but it has proven to be a high-quality, rigorous process where teachers have to show evidence of their work and do an enormous amount of self-reflection. Now, I haven't gone through it, so it didn't even exist when I was a teacher. But the teachers that I know who have gone through it swear by it in terms of elevating their own practice. Whether it's, I was just using it as an example of what of the need for some type of boards. And I know, Randy, you wrote a piece about this maybe a couple years ago. The question is, what are the standards, right? What are the standards for the teaching profession, whether it's national board or something else? And those standards can range in different places. That's not actually what people want, and it's not fair to our kids either. When we say that, well, anyone can teach or there aren't consistent standards. So I just think we have to have consistent standards. The National Board happens to provide one in a way that really provides a significant amount of reflection and professional development and growth for teachers. But if there are others out there, great.
It's one of the ideas that Shanker had a long time ago, and was at that period of time something that was realized. And I agree with Josh, people who are board certified swear by it. Karen Lewis is a board certified teacher. Mary Catherine Ricker is a board certified teacher. People are really proud of being board certified teachers. There's none of the kind of issues that you saw around merit pay or anything else, because it really is about what you know and how you demonstrate that. But there are other types of things. What we're starting to look at more and more and more are two things. We have a teacher leadership program that's done within the union where teachers start learning how to do their own research, how to work together, how to become leaders in their own schools and their own districts. And that's a program that we keep expanding. And I think that these urban residencies, and I don't mean to call them only urban, but the kind of like teaching hospitals, thinking about more investment at the beginning of a teacher's career, not just in terms of teacher preparation, but the first few years of induction, and really thinking about clinical opportunities in that kind of way will also be very, very helpful.
I'm going to move to the next question, and we'll start with Dan this time. This question, the person says there appears to be a movement in some states to not pay teachers for higher degrees, like master's degrees. So teachers are not necessarily pursuing those degrees. The incentive is gone. This also impacts teacher preparation, obviously. How do we address this, and does it hurt the profession that incentive is gone by the wayside in some places?
I think it hurts the profession if teacher pay is too low, which it is overall. So you've got a structural problem, and we can certainly debate where you should invest. There's not a lot of research that shows that a general master's degree in education makes you a better teacher. It's not to say it doesn't have any value, not to say that it might not be worth supporting. But if you're paying teachers 30% below what other professionals make, generally you can't move out of your parents' basement if you want to become a teacher if you're a young person. That's a fundamental problem. Again, back to the Brad
So are
Pitt thing.
states doing this because
Are
they just want
well-
lower compensation, generally speaking, or?
Why states are doing it? Gosh, I didn't even take psychology 101 in college, but I think it's easier. Let me put it this way: it's easier to deal with the small issues than the big issues, obviously. And if the big issue is teachers don't make enough, and you're going to have to make some structural changes, you're going to have to make some tax changes, whatever it is, in order to address that. But you can say, look, we're paying a lot for master's degrees, doesn't seem to be making a big difference, then it's going to be easier to pick off that issue. Now, what I would say is, in the Common Core era, there is even more of a premium now on content knowledge, particularly for secondary teachers, particularly, I would say, in STEM subjects. And so the reality is we don't pay any premium to whether it's on the front end or whether it's during a teacher's career for, having a background in math or physics or technology and so forth. And that is those are shortage areas over and over and over again, as is bilingual and special education. We kind of wring our hands every year when that happens. we don't really tend to have strategies to really systemically address that problem. So yes, you can debate about master's degrees generally, whether that's where you should be putting your money, but that, whether you get that right, depending on where you are, that's not going to fix the fundamental problem.
If I can just add to that just briefly, I do think, and I, just, so I do think there has been a movement for a while to contest anything that is part of, the status quo, so to speak. And master's programs are part of the status quo teacher prep. And look, there are a lot of really bad ones. I mean, there's no doubt. Now that I'm in the business of the pre-service with our Educators Rising program, we can talk about that later. But it's amazing to see the lack of quality of programs. But I do think there is a political movement that's been going on for a while to say anything that is related to the status quo should be done away with. And there are legitimate concerns about the status quo, but it doesn't mean you should just, do away with master's programs.
So this next question relates to ESSA, which is the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, now known as No Child Left Behind. So this person notes that the bill that has the conference report that's passed the Senate, the House, and is before the Senate, gets rid of the highly qualified teacher provisions in that law. And essentially what this means is that that teacher quality will just be a state regulated area, and each state can determine teacher quality. And the questioner asks, how do you build a profession when there are 51 different state expectations?
So I would actually argue that the No Child Left Behind, in combination with Race to the Top, didn't build teacher capacity even when we had the highly qualified provision in the law. Mm-hmm. So it's not as if there's, we need to have a different accountability system that is not just reduced to 2 test scores and an algorithm that basically defines or dictates what everybody is doing all the time. And there will be states that do this extraordinarily well, and there will be states that do this extraordinarily badly. And we're going to have to actually be able to do the advocacy so that we don't have what happened, in the last half of the century, which is the inequity, the lack of integration, all the things that we've seen. I don't think that that's the biggest challenge under ESSA. I think the biggest challenge under ESSA is that that we're going to have to help states create accountability systems that are aligned to, I'm going to go back to what Josh said at the beginning, what do kids need to know and be able to do? And how do we help create a system that effectively provides that? And to have enough room now in terms of the different components of accountability that enable you to do that. Mm-hmm. That's going to be the biggest challenge. And it also goes back to something, in terms of teacher compensation that all of us have been saying over and over again. If we don't make the status and structure and emoluments of this profession one that people want to go into and stay in, then it actually doesn't matter what is in any federal law or any state law. We need to get people who want to go in and stay as teachers, and we need to value the profession.
And the only quick thing I'd add on that, Stephen, is it is a concern that in ESSA you see the traditional federal role as kind of the insurer of equity is curtailed. Now, I don't think anybody knows exactly how that's going to play out, but I worry about that. So the point of the question about our system of federalism, you got 51 different systems. But one thing the federal government can, and in my view should continue to do, is promote transparency. And I go back to, if what most parents and most students expect out of their schools and their school systems is that if they do everything that's asked, they're going to be ready for college after they graduate high school, the federal government can continue to do a good job, even if you've got 51 different accountability systems, of putting out information on the extent to which states are meeting that need. And different states are meeting it at different rates, and the trends are different in different states, and parents ought to know that, and voters ought to know that, and the federal government ought to continue to do everything they can to put good, objective, accurate information out there.
Leo, do we have any questions that have come in online? No. Nope, okay.
Okay.
All right, I will shuffle for the next one. Okay, we know there is an inequitable distribution of teachers. How do we assure that every child gets a quality teacher?
So this goes back to something Dan said earlier, I think, around what the district expects. One thing, when you were talking about the Rubik's Cube, like where do you start? So I mentioned that you start with teaching and learning, but you also have to start with equity and have really, really clear understanding of how you make sure those who need the most get the most. So whether that is paying teachers more for taking on more difficult jobs, whether that is providing more resources in schools so that teachers that go into schools that with more vulnerable kids have the supports that they need, you have to make it really, really clear and expect it as a system. And this goes back to what I said before about from the classroom to the boardroom, whether that's board policies, right? And I don't know any district or school board, any responsible school board and district must have some type of equity policy or framework these days. They have to be clear about what it means. You have to examine it, you got to look at it, and then you got to line up your budget to it and be very transparent and say, okay, if we do, because it's not fair to just give everybody the same and then say, okay, teachers in the Title I school or the school allowed Title I kids, whatever it may be, do the same work. You have to give them support. It's a systems issue, but you also have to make sure, when I say you, I mean the superintendent, school board, others, have to have the political will and capital to be able to make those difficult decisions, because in this day and age, oftentimes you have to take away from some in order to give to those who need it, but you got to be really straightforward and clear about it, and it has to start from the top as far as I'm concerned.
This, I would say, of all the different questions that I've gotten over the last 20 some odd years, this one is the one that bothers me the most. Not because of the question, but every school district in America has struggling schools, or virtually everyone. And in places where communities have struggled economically, you see even more and more. It's not something new. It's something that we've seen for years. So if you're the superintendent, if you're the school board, your character very much depends on what are you going to do with teachers, if you have a union, with your union, with communities, to actually turn around struggling schools. Not to constantly shake them up and fear them and tell them if they don't get better, they're going to close, or you're going to create competition. But what are the strategies? What are the incentives? What are the investments that we actually know, and how you're going to align them together to turn around a struggling school? And if it can't happen, then maybe the school has to close. But what are you going to do in terms of that neighborhood? And there's lots of us who have done different things. I still think that the best, at least from from the arc of my career, the thing I was most proud of is doing that work in New York in the Chancellor's District. And every elementary school turned around within a year or two. And that was a huge statement to the communities. And what happened is people actually stayed. They saw that there was a commitment, and great teachers actually came, stayed, got trained, did different things. So it's a solvable problem, not 100%, but a lot more than what we're doing right now if we were willing to do it.
So I was just looking, there was a full page out in the New York Times, which I thought was great, about a program in New York State to honor great teachers, and that's terrific. We have our own program, Fishman Prize. Those of you great teachers apply for the Fishman Prize, but this is terrific. We don't do enough to honor our great teachers. And it had, little blurbs about each one of these half dozen teachers. Every single one of them was either an AP or a gifted and talented teacher. Nothing wrong with that. That's great. We need great teachers in those classrooms for sure. I don't think that's bad. But what it reflects to me is we have an issue with priorities in the profession. So why isn't the ninth grade ramp-up teacher ever the one honored? Why isn't the District 75 teacher working in the self-contained classroom the one honored and that's not because of the teachers aren't doing great work. They're not selecting themselves, right? So we, in the military, those of you who served, if you want to get ahead, you're going to take on the toughest challenges. Now, often in the military, that means the most dangerous challenge, and that's how you're going to move up in your career. It's not the way we do it in education. That's not the policies we set. So teachers are rational just like everybody else. If you say, look, you can take a very challenging job in a place where it's a building that's very old, where it's really hot in the summer and cold in the winter, the kids are coming to you with tremendous challenges, or same pay, maybe even greater prestige, be in a place with there are less challenges. That's a nice place to work. Hey, I know what I would decide. You're going to go to the place with less challenges over time. That's what's going to happen, and that is what happens. If we don't level the playing field in some way, and that's not just about money, although I think money is part of it, if we don't say, hey, look, this is how you get ahead. If you are that great teacher who year after year is doing terrific things with kids coming to the classroom with tremendous challenges in a struggling neighborhood, that's what's going to rocket you to the top of the profession, then I think we've got something. But right now, the incentives are all the reverse.
Can I just add one quick thing too? We oftentimes talk about the teacher distribution issue between schools. Within schools can oftentimes be more important. Who's teaching AP versus who's teaching ninth grade math? And in the best schools, right, you distribute the courses to the teachers, so they have, a math teacher's teaching ninth grade and they're teaching AP and whatever it may be. And that's a supervision evaluation issue of the principal, right? To say, okay, do you know who your best are? How are you aligning them? But look at it within a school as much as you look at it among schools. And again, these can be no-cost ways of actually improving when you just know each one of your people and say, let me make sure that they're put in a place where they're going to do the most good for kids.
One of the worst things about evaluation by test scores is that we've seen a lot of data that has shown that it has thwarted people from going and staying in hard-to-staff schools because people were getting, because of when you look at the data, the data showed that lots and lots of kids who were highly challenged, their teachers were getting they were getting the lower end of the evaluations. And so part of the next generation of teacher evaluation is to really think about how to align it, Dan, in the way in which you're talking about, which is what are the skills that kids need to know and be able to do, and how do we create fair feedback and evaluation systems in that regard?
Well, just like your panelists today, teachers get sick and have to take days off. So many students are taught by substitute teachers every day. In fact, Emma Brown had a very good story in the Washington Post about this, I think, this weekend. How can we be sure that there are enough qualified substitute teachers?
Nobody
It's
wants
all
to
you,
take that
Dan.
one
I'm
then.
calling on you first.
Well, so one thing that I always wish I could have done when I was superintendent is actually given the experience that I had when I started, what I forgot to mention, my school was in quarter system. The first quarter, the principal would not assign me a class because she's like, you don't know anything, and you're going to sit with other teachers. You're going to sub, right? Different times you're going to do lunch duty, and it was actually great because I got to know the kids and got to know teachers. I always thought, what if you could actually pay a first-year teacher to not have a class, Now, the cost, of course, is high, but if for
You
me,
pay them to sub.
pay them.
essentially?
They could sub. They could work with other teachers and collaborate. They get to know the kids, get to know the culture, but not get thrown in. Now, again, the cost is really high, but it is
Is it
something.
any higher than hiring a whole bunch of
Yeah,
substitutes
it is.
randomly?
It is because you got
'Cause they're
benefits.
paid at, like, a
Yeah,
random- that's true,
exactly.
okay.
It doesn't exactly work out, but it actually would be a better way to induct a teacher into the profession by not necessarily give them a full-time class. It costs too much. Again, part of it comes down to what the teacher is responsible for when they're not there, and are they responsible and accountable for leaving a lesson plan that can happen without them? And since we see more and more student work, teamwork and collaboration, there are things that can happen. And then I keep going back to the principal, but there are the best principals don't allow bad subs to come back to their buildings, right? They call down to the central office and say, never let that person in my building again. And it's another thing that the principal has to do. So Dan's right about that, but that's pretty much the way you gotta call that and say, don't ever let that person back in my building, and the central office typically won't.
Retired teachers.
Retired.
Retired
I would,
teachers.
the trying to figure out, again, this is really a back office function in terms of really thinking about pools, retired teachers, giving people who sub for X number of days a leg up in interviews for regular jobs that come up. There are ways to try to create bigger and better pools of subs. Have somebody who is a lead teacher, if you had in a district a bunch of lead teachers, and then as part of the process, each of them, take a month where they're also, they relinquish the lead teacher job but do substituting. So you basically have some of your best teachers be subs as opposed to some of the more inexperienced. There's a bunch of different ways that we should be trying, but I find that the pool idea and trying to incentivize so that people who want teaching jobs will actually, sub for a year or two, and then they know that they have a leg up, tend to work.
Do we have all the cards in? Is there anybody else who has one floating around? I want to make sure we get to everyone. Okay, I have one more here. This person notes that there is research showing that fit with a school is highly related to teacher effectiveness. In other words, that a teacher might be more effective in one school with a particular set of norms than in another one. How do we make sure that school fit and school culture work to support teaching and learning?
Well, one of the things you can do is measure it, which we don't tend to do. So, there are plenty of instruments out there, including ours, that survey teachers and ask them things like, in this school, do you get time to collaborate with your colleagues? Do you feel that administration, wants to help you to improve, et cetera? And the great thing about adopting a system like that where you're trying to measure school culture, and by the way, I would say the other totally underutilized resource there is asking kids. I don't think we survey kids enough, and I think that produces really rich, useful, valuable data. I'd like to say that, even the best principal, that principal Josh is talking about, who's a great scheduler, who gets into every classroom to do an observation for each teacher 6 or 10 times a year, still is only seeing 10% of the body of work of that teacher. Students are seeing 100% of that body of work, and it's really interesting to ask them what they think about the culture of the school and even the culture of the classroom. So if you measure it, you get the information, you start to compare it, you will see variation. Classroom to classroom, school to school, that will tell you interesting things as you're doing professional development with your principals, for example. And then you can see trends over time. One of the things Randy talks about turnarounds, one of the things that is likely, at least in my view, a leading indicator of student achievement beginning to turn around is school culture turning around. And it works the other way too. If you see school culture really dropping, and the kids and teachers feeling like the environment in the school is really becoming toxic, you're probably about to see student achievement dropping as well. And you're about to see demand among parents in the community to send their kids to that school dropping as well. So the first thing is begin to measure it, which we do very, very rarely across the country.
So, a parent in Brooklyn, who actually was fairly high up in the, I forget which administration, in New York City, said to me one day, we always look at whether or not schools in New York City, this is about 10 years ago because Joel Klein eliminated this process, or 20 years ago. We always look at whether or not schools are SBO staffing schools. Now that was, a term in New York City, but it was essentially that the school staffed itself. And that the parents, there were parents on the committee, but teachers and the principal basically made the staffing decisions going forward. And it was one of the best ways. It was very interesting to hear this comment from a parent because it was the measurement test at that moment in time about whether or not a school was really working towards figuring out the fit by having those interviews and making those decisions themselves. My point in telling the story is there's a lot of different ways of measuring this, but fit in a school is really, really important. You can find it, you can do it. Most people know if, most people want to go to school being happy, whether you're kids, whether you're teachers. And so it's a really important thing to try to figure out.
So, Dan, was it you that eliminated that? Yeah. Sorry. You guys get along well now, though. So just real quick, so it depends on the structure of the system, but HR in most school systems does not look that different than it did 100 years ago, right? And the extent to which, so Dan's absolutely right in terms of measuring. I love the Gallup surveys around student engagement, student voice is really important. Teacher engagement is really important, but there's also all the strengths work. Strengths finders work, and it goes back to the idea of: do you know everybody in your school? Do you know what you're looking for? And then how well does the hiring office, whatever that function may be, do they really understand what the school needs, and are they in partnership with the school? But we need to do major overhaul of HR functions, and again, it goes back to the R&D function of school systems. There's not a lot of money invested in any of this, because in order to do that, you're taking away from the classroom, or you're not giving to the classroom, and nobody can stand that politically. But you have to, we have to completely reshape the way we think about the HR functions in school systems.
It's interesting that's such a theme today, like the back office, like these things that we don't think about and take for granted, but really do affect, where teachers are placed, what kind of resources are distributed. So on that note, I think we're going to wrap up.
Can I make one quick
can
point?
make
I'm
one
sorry,
more
but
quick point.
this theme kept coming up earlier about, people don't want to go into teaching. So through the new program we have at PDK, Educators Rising, which takes high school kids who want to become teachers, this is what we found. Kids don't want to go into teaching. But when you ask them, do you want to make a difference? They say yes. Do you want to work with kids? Yes. Do you want to work with a group of like-minded individuals? Yes. Do you want to work in a mission-oriented organization? Yes. So they want to actually make a difference and do all this great stuff, but they don't see teaching as a way to do it. And maybe because they think of teaching as, I do this for 30 years and I look at my teacher and they just don't seem happy. But they want to do all those things that teachers actually do, particularly the good ones that, end up taking on different roles and leadership positions, yet they don't see teaching as the avenue to the kind of fulfilling life that they want as young people. And so we're trying to bridge that now, but I think part of what we have to do nationally is sort of reframe what it actually means to be an education professional, an educator, and not just think of it as I've been teaching wearing the same clothes in the same classroom in the same place for 35 years. Because kids actually want that, and if it's reframed, they'll actually jump to it. That's why we have 12,000 kids who have signed up to our Educators Rising program, right? Half of whom are kids of color, right? You know, and it's just by reframing what it means to be a teacher. So.